Hey guys, this is Mr. Winters. In this video I'm going to take you through the different types of sanders that we have and the safety on them and how to use them and the purpose of what they're used for. There's always a process of how you sand something, and I'll be honest, it's not everybody's favorite thing to do, but it is what makes your project look really nice and shows that you took pride in your work. So the first thing I'm going to show you is this area right here and the couple sanders that we have. Okay, this is called a palm sander. And this is used to just basically sand stuff. You can sand the face, the edges, the end grains. And now as far as how you change the paper, that's what you need to know how to do. You've got these two little wires on each end. You pop those off. And that part opens up. And then you have this piece right here that you pinch. And that comes out. I've got a box here with different types of sandpaper in them. You're going to notice that one of them says 120 and one of them says 220. What that is talking about is the grit of sandpaper and how much sand is in a square inch of this sandpaper. The lower the number, the more rough the sandpaper is and the more wood it will remove. So what you have to learn is on your first sanding, you always do it in two steps. You start with 120, anywhere from 100 to 120. And then you sand the thing one time. Then you're going to wet the project down, and I'll show you how to do that. And what it does is it causes, just like when you get goosebumps and the hair on your arms stand up, when you get a piece of wood wet, the wood fibers stand up, and then you sand it with 220, and it makes your wood feel like a piece of glass. It makes it really, really smooth. So whenever you're going to sand something, always start with a new piece of sandpaper. Can get hurt if you're not being safe, so make sure you're wearing safety glasses because that can be kicking wood up at you. And then when we use these other sanders, the spindle sander and the belt and disc sander, those have motors and are spinning, so they can grab things like this or your hair or this is the big one right here. People don't pull their sleeves up and it gets grabbed into the machine. So you can get hurt using a sander. So I'll show you how this works real quick. So I'm going to start, and I'm just going to sand this piece of wood. It's the one I've been using for all these videos. And I'm going to get this thing to be nice and smooth. As you can see, there's still pencil on there, so I'm going to sand that off. So I'm going to take a new piece of 120 grit sandpaper. I pinch this to open that, slide the piece in. Then you fold it over and tuck this like that. Then these two metal wires go around like that. Now when you're sanding, the one thing you don't want to do is sand across the grain and just be going like this, because that'll scratch the wood. You want to try to sand with the grain, and I like to do little circles with the sander as I'm going with the grain. Again, when we first sand, we start with 120 grit. I'm going to put my safety glasses on. Well, this is not very loud, but when I'm running power tools, I still like to use my hearing protection. So I'm basically just going to go with the grain in little circles. Now when you're sanding, you got to sand all the parts. So I'm going to do the bottom, the edges, the end grains, and the top. So there's my first sanding with the 120 grit. And you know you're doing it right because the board will start to get a lighter color. So as I first started this, it was kind of a darker, and as I've sanded it, it's gotten lighter. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wet this board down with a wet rag. So I'm just taking a wet rag and wiping this thing all the way down. Now this will do two things. It'll, like I said earlier, it'll cause all the wood fibers to raise up, and it'll also show you if there's any glue that you missed. Because you'll see the glue when you get it wet, you'll see the pieces where you still have glue or a pencil mark or something like that that you still have to sand off. Now, you can't sand this while it's wet. You have to wait till it dries. So once this is dry, I'm gonna use the palm sander again, and I'm gonna put a 220 sheet on this, and I'm gonna sand it with 220. So I'll wait till this dries, and then I'll sand it with 220. Okay, my board's all dry, so now I'm gonna change the sheet of paper here. So this is 120, I'm gonna take that off. And now I'm gonna put on a sheet of 220. A lot of times it says it right on the back right here. So now I'm gonna use 220 grit sandpaper. Now before I sand this, something you need to know that if you're trying to get pencil marks off or glue or a rough piece, 220 is not gonna do it. You have to use 120 to remove those rough things. You use 220 when you're ready to do the final finish, and it's gonna make it smooth like glass. So I've made sure that my board is dry. There's no glue. There's no real rough spots. There's no big gouges or pencil marks. So now I'm just ready for the final finish of 220. So I'm gonna do the same process, do the bottom, all the edges, and then the top. All right, now I know you can't feel this, but that feels as smooth as glass. Okay, so that's how you use the palm sander. This is the one you're gonna use the most. And you always gotta remember that it's a 3-step process. Sand with 120 first, then get the project wet and let the wood fibers raise up, and then sand with 220 grit sandpaper. Now I also have a couple other sanders in here. This is called an orbital sander, and it's just like a palm sander. The only difference is it takes these little round discs, and I use these more if I'm doing like a bigger piece of wood. Like if I have to do a tabletop or maybe a cutting board or just something that's larger, I like to use this because it's a little bit easier on my hand and it doesn't vibrate so much. And for all of this, it's just a sticky pad. So you pull it off, you put those back on. We also have a sander in here. It's called a belt sander. If you decide to make one of the pencil holders, you'll use this to level out a bunch of edges, and it just takes a belt. Okay, we also have some power sanders in here that you're gonna use. This one here is called a spindle sander. Sander takes these little sanding drums. When you turn this on, and you'll see this thing goes up and down and spins. Now, the first thing you need to know that I do not want you to change this. If you need a different one of these, let me know and I'll help you switch it out because there's a lot of little pieces that we have to mess with. I have the 3/4 inch drum on right now because the projects that we're gonna make, this is the one that we need. Now the main thing that you use a spindle sander for is if you have to sand the edges of like a curve. So like you can see on this fish, I have a curve right here. If I'm gonna sand that, that's really hard to do with a palm sander. So I'm either gonna use my hand and use hand paper, or I could use this tool. Now the one thing you need to know on this is you need to know which way it's turning. So I have drawn on there arrows of which way that drum is spinning. So it's spinning this direction. You always want to go into the direction that it's spinning. If I go over here, it's going to kick it. If I go over here, it'll stay tight to the sander. So I'll just show you a little bit of this, of how you could round this edge. So make sure you have safety glasses, you got your hearing protection. The last sander I want to show you is the belt and disc sander. So this is a two-part machine. It's got a belt sander up here. Now I've added a table to this to help keep it sturdy and safe for us here in school. And then it also has a disc down here that sands at the same time. So if you're using the belt sander, you need to make sure that your wood is always tight to the table. If you're using the disc sander, you're also going to be using this miter gauge. And you have to make sure that your wood is tight to the table and tight to this gauge. You'll notice two things. On the disc sander, I have a part on here that says use this half. You only want to use this half of the machine, because that disc is spinning this direction. So if you come over here, it's going to throw your wood that way. If you use it over here, it's going to keep it tight to the table. So you always use this half of the disc. If you're using the belt sander, you got to be tight to this table, and you've got to watch that your stuff doesn't get stuck in that gap right there. Now the biggest thing that people get hurt on this machine is you got to know that when this is turning, so is this. The on and off switch is back here. So when I turn that on, both things are spinning. So what'll happen is people will reach and they'll hit that. So you need to know that both things are spinning at the same time. These get grabbed and yanked in. So make sure you have your sleeves all the way pulled up, and if you have long sleeves like that, that they are out of the way. Now what I'm going to do is just show you a little bit of how this will work. So if I'm using this, I'm tight to the table, and I can sand like this. Now, another rule with this machine is you should only ever take 1/16 off at a time. If you have to sand more than 1/16 of an inch, you didn't make a good enough cut, and you need to cut again. So I'll just kind of show you a little bit about how each one of these sanders works. Okay, that's a quick rundown of all the sanding tools that we have in this shop and the safety and the basics of how to use them. If you have any questions or need me to show you, feel free to ask and I'll walk you through it in person. Just try to remember when you're sanding that it's always a 3-step process. First step is 100 to 120 grit paper. That's your first sand. Then you get the wood wet down, causes the wood fibers to raise up, and then you finish with 220 grit sandpaper. Just remember that nobody likes to sand. It's everybody's least favorite part, but don't skimp on the sanding. It's what makes your project look very, very good, and it shows that you take pride in it, and it's going to look like a finished piece of wood. Be safe, be creative, have fun, use these sanders to make your project look awesome. We'll see you on the next video.